I pulled into the driveway at 11:30 at night, headlights cutting across the front of the house I'd lived in for 32 years. My wife's surgery had gone longer than expected, complications with the anesthesia, then monitoring, then more monitoring. I'd stayed until they moved her into recovery and told me to go home, get some sleep, come back in the morning. I was exhausted. My hands were still shaking from the hours of waiting in that fluorescent corridor, watching doctors walk past without making eye contact. The house was dark except for the porch light. I expected that. What I didn't expect was the smell. The moment I opened the door, I smelled something faint and sour, like old laundry left in a machine too long. I set my keys down on the table in the entryway and stood still, listening. The house was silent. My son's car was in the driveway, but I didn't hear the television or music or anything that suggested someone was awake. I called his name. No answer. I walked through the kitchen. A plate with crumbs sat in the sink. A glass of water half empty on the counter. I opened the basement door without thinking. Force of habit. Really. We kept the washer and dryer down there, and I thought maybe that's where the smell was coming from. The door was locked. That stopped me. We never locked the basement door. There wasn't even a reason to. It was unfinished, just concrete and storage boxes in the utility area. I tried the handle again. Definitely locked. I stood there for a moment confused, and then I heard it. A voice, faint, coming from below. I pressed my ear to the door. It was my mother. She was calling my name. My heart kicked hard in my chest. I pounded on the door and shouted down through the crack, asking if she was all right, asking what happened. Her voice came back shaky, almost hoarse. She said she'd been down there since yesterday. She said my son had put her there. I didn't understand. I still don't think I fully processed it in that moment. I ran upstairs and went into my son's room without knocking. He was asleep, or pretending to be. I turned on the light and told him to get up. He sat up slowly, blinking, and I asked him where the key to the basement was. He looked at me like I'd asked him something in a foreign language. I repeated the question. He rubbed his eyes and said he didn't know what I was talking about. I told him his grandmother was locked in the basement. He stared at me for a long moment, and then he said, "She's confused." That's all he said. I went back downstairs, grabbed a screwdriver from the garage, and pried the lock plate off the door. It took me 10 minutes. My hands were shaking so badly I kept dropping the screws. When I finally got the door open, I found my mother sitting on the bottom step in her nightgown, arms wrapped around herself. There was a blanket on the floor beside her, a jug of water, and a bucket in the corner. A bucket. She looked up at me and started crying. Not loud crying, just silent tears running down her face. I helped her up the stairs and into the guest room. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. I got her water, a clean blanket, and I sat with her until she stopped shaking. She didn't want to talk. She just kept saying she was tired. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my wife's nurse and explained that I couldn't come to the hospital yet. I didn't tell her why. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and waited for my son to come downstairs. He didn't. I went back up to his room. He was awake, on his phone. I asked him again what happened. He said my mother had been acting out. He said she'd been hostile, saying things that didn't make sense, and he thought it would be safer to keep her downstairs until I got home. Safer. I asked him why he didn't call me. He said he didn't want to worry me while Mom was in surgery. I asked him why he locked the door. He said he didn't want her wandering around the house and hurting herself. I asked him why there was a bucket. He didn't answer that. I told him to get out of the house. He looked at me like I'd slapped him. I repeated it. I said I wanted him gone by the time I got back from the hospital, and that I'd figure out what came next after I talked to his mother. He stood up slowly, and for the first time I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Not anger, not shame, just cold, flat calculation. He said, "You're going to regret this." Then he left. I drove back to the hospital in a fog. I sat with my wife while she woke up fully, held her hand, listened to the doctor explain her recovery plan. I didn't tell her what I'd come home to. She was in pain, disoriented, and I didn't want to add to that. I told her everything was fine at home. I told her I'd take care of everything. When I got back that evening, my mother was still in the guest room. I knocked softly and asked if I could come in. She nodded. I sat down in the chair by the window and asked her to tell me what happened. She spoke slowly, like she was pulling each sentence out of deep water. She said my son had told her I'd asked him to handle things while I was at the hospital. He'd said I wanted her to stay downstairs because I was worried about her falling on the stairs. She'd argued. She'd said that didn't sound like something I would say. That's when he'd taken her phone. Then he'd walked her downstairs and locked the door behind her. She'd banged on the door. She'd shouted. No one came. She'd spent a day and a half down there in the dark, sitting on the stairs, drinking water from a jug he'd left behind, trying not to think about the bucket he'd put in the corner. I asked her if he'd said anything else. She nodded. She said he'd come to the door once, maybe 6 hours in. She'd heard his footsteps upstairs. He'd stood outside the door and said, "You should have signed the papers when I asked." That's when I knew this wasn't a mistake. I went into my office and pulled up my bank accounts. I hadn't checked them in a few days. I'd been too focused on my wife's surgery. What I saw made my stomach drop. There were withdrawal requests, pending transfers, authorization forms I'd never signed. Someone had tried to move money out of our joint account and into a new account I didn't recognize. The requests had been flagged by the bank's fraud system, but they were still sitting there, waiting for verification. I called the bank. They confirmed that someone had submitted the requests online using my login credentials. The IP address traced back to my own home network. I asked when the requests had been made. They said 2 days ago, while I was at the hospital with my wife. I asked if anyone had tried to verify them in person. They said yes. Someone had come into a branch across town and presented a power of attorney document with my signature. I didn't have a power of attorney. I'd never signed one. I told them to freeze everything. They said they already had, pending verification. I said I'd come in tomorrow with identification and documentation. They said that would be fine. I hung up and sat there in the dark, trying to piece it together. My son had been asking my mother to sign something. She'd refused. He'd locked her in the basement to pressure her, or to keep her out of the way. He'd tried to move money using forged documents. He'd waited until the house was empty, until I was distracted, until no one was looking. I thought about the last 6 months, the way he'd been hanging around more, the way he'd started asking questions about finances, about my wife's medical costs, about my mother's living situation. I'd thought he was just being helpful. Concerned I'd been wrong. The next day, I went to the bank with every piece of identification I had. I sat down with a manager and explained the situation. She pulled up the flagged transactions and showed me the forged power of attorney document. The signature was close enough that I could see how someone might have traced it. But it wasn't mine. She made copies. She flagged the account for additional security. She told me I should file a police report. I asked her what would happen if I did. She said it depended on whether I wanted to press charges. She said cases like this, especially within families, were complicated. She said banks see it more often than people think. I thanked her and left. I didn't go to the police. Not yet. I went to see a lawyer instead. I explained everything: the basement, the forged documents, the withdrawal attempts, the power of attorney, the threats. I asked what my options were. He listened carefully, took notes, and then leaned back in his chair. He said I could file for a restraining order. I could report the fraud. I could pursue criminal charges for false imprisonment and forgery. Or I could wait. I asked him what waiting would accomplish. He said it would give me time to see the full picture. He said if my son had gone this far, there was probably more I didn't know yet. He said people who forge documents and lock elderly relatives in basements don't usually stop at one attempt. He told me to document everything: dates, times, photos, bank records, witness statements. He said to keep my mother safe and to watch my accounts like a hawk. He said when people like my son make their next move, they usually make it bigger. I went home and started writing everything down. 3 days later, my wife came home from the hospital. She was weak but stable. I set her up in our bedroom with everything she needed, and I told her I had to take care of some things. She asked if everything was okay. I said it would be. That night, my son called. I didn't answer. He called again an hour later, then again. On the fourth call, I picked up. He said he wanted to come by and clear the air. He said there had been a misunderstanding. I told him I didn't think there was anything to clear. He said he'd made a mistake, that he'd panicked, that he hadn't meant for things to go the way they did. I asked him what he meant by things. He stumbled. He said he just wanted to help. He said he knew medical bills were piling up and he thought he could take some of the pressure off me. He said Grandma had gotten in the way and he didn't know what else to do. I asked him if he forged my signature. Silence. Then he said, "We can fix this." I told him not to come back to the house. I told him any further contact should go through my lawyer. Then I hung up. 2 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. It was from a legal aid office downtown. My son had filed a petition claiming that I was experiencing cognitive decline and that my mother was being neglected in my care. He was requesting a court-ordered evaluation and a temporary guardianship transfer. I read the letter 3 times. Then I called my lawyer. He wasn't surprised. He said this was the bigger move he'd expected. He said my son was trying to establish a legal narrative that would justify his earlier actions and position himself as the responsible party. He said if the petition succeeded, my son could potentially take control of my finances, my mother's care, and even decision-making authority over my wife's medical situation. He said we needed to respond immediately. We did. We submitted medical records showing I'd been cleared by my own doctor less than a month ago. We submitted bank records showing no signs of financial mismanagement. We submitted a signed statement from my mother describing what had happened in the basement. We submitted the fraud report from the bank and the forged power of attorney. We requested a full hearing. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, I installed cameras in the house. I changed all the locks. I gave my mother a phone with emergency contacts programmed in. I made sure my wife knew where every important document was stored. And I waited. My son tried to visit twice. Both times I didn't open the door. He tried calling from different numbers. I blocked them all. He sent messages through relatives, saying I was being unreasonable, that he just wanted to help, that I was pushing the family apart. I didn't respond. The day of the hearing, I arrived early. My lawyer met me in the hallway outside the courtroom and went over everything one more time. He told me to stay calm, to answer only what was asked, and to let the evidence speak. My son arrived 10 minutes later with a lawyer of his own, a young guy in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. We sat on opposite sides of the courtroom. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. The judge was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of expression that suggested she'd heard every excuse in the book. She reviewed the petition, the response, and the evidence. Then she asked my son's lawyer to present his case. He stood and made his argument. He said I'd been under significant stress due to my wife's medical situation. He said my mother had been found in unsafe conditions. He said my son had acted out of concern and that any financial irregularities were the result of miscommunication. The judge asked if there was any evidence of my cognitive decline. The lawyer hesitated. He said there were reports from family members. The judge asked to see them. There weren't any. Then my lawyer stood. He didn't waste time. He presented the medical records, the bank fraud report, the forged signature, the photos of the basement, my mother's signed statement. He presented the timeline, how everything had happened while I was at the hospital, how my son had moved quickly and deliberately, how he'd tried to cover his tracks. He also presented something I hadn't expected. Security footage. My lawyer had subpoenaed footage from the bank branch where my son had tried to present the forged power of attorney. The footage showed him at the counter, confident, handing over documents, walking out when the teller said they'd need to verify. The judge watched the footage in silence. Then she looked at my son and asked him directly if he had forged my signature. He said he'd been trying to help. She asked again, yes or no. He said yes. The courtroom went very quiet. The judge set down her pen. She said the petition was denied. She said if any further attempts were made to access my accounts, file legal actions against me, or contact my mother without consent, she would refer the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. She said the hearing was over. I walked out of that courtroom and stood in the hallway for a long time, just breathing. My lawyer shook my hand. He said I'd done everything right. He said most people don't catch it this early. I asked him what happened to the ones who don't. He didn't answer. I drove home and told my wife everything. She cried, not because she was surprised. I think part of her had already known, but because it hurt, because it was our son, because we'd raised him and trusted him, and somewhere along the way, he'd decided we were obstacles instead of people. We talked for hours that night. We decided not to press charges. Not because we forgave him, but because we didn't want to spend the next year of our lives in courtrooms. We wanted to heal. We wanted quiet. But we also made it clear he wasn't welcome back. My mother stayed with us. We converted the downstairs office into a bedroom for her. She started gardening again. She started smiling again, slowly. My wife recovered. It took months, but she got stronger. We took walks in the evening. We talked about small things, groceries, the neighbor's dog, the weather. It felt good to talk about small things again. I never heard from my son directly after that. I heard he moved 2 states over. I heard he got a job in sales. I heard he told people we'd had a falling out over money. I don't correct the story. It doesn't matter. What matters is that my mother is safe. My wife is healthy. The locks are strong, the accounts are secure, and the house is ours again. Some betrayals don't announce themselves with shouting or violence. They come quietly, in the middle of the night, with a key in a locked door and a bucket in the corner. They come from the people you trusted most, because they know you won't see it coming. But once you do see it, once you stand at that basement door and hear the voice on the other side, you can't unhear it, and you have a choice. You can pretend it didn't happen. You can forgive too quickly. You can let fear or guilt or love convince you to look the other way. Or you can do what needs to be done, quietly, carefully, with the same patience they used against you, not for revenge, not for satisfaction, but for safety, for dignity, for the people who couldn't fight back on their own. I chose the latter, and I would do it again. If you've ever stayed silent just long enough to see the truth clearly, if you've ever had to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves, you're not alone.